Good morning, and I'm very happy to be back here at in UP with you. This is certainly a much nicer place to be than at the House of Representatives. Certainly more intellectually stimulating. Okay. And ayaw ko nang umalis rito eh. Pero anyway. I'm terribly sorry for being late, but we had to spring somebody from the airport who was a delegate to one of the fisher folk conferences who unfortunately had a passport, an Indonesian who had a passport that was going to run out in about 3 months in terms of its validity. So he was about to be deported back to Indonesia, but so we had to get him out of the airport, and and that's the reason I'm late. So those of you who travel, make sure that your passports are at least 6 months in terms of having validity. Okay, I really don't know what has happened before, but I think Renato and Tere have probably already given you a very, very good sense of the dynamics of democratization. I would just like to speak from my own perspective, maybe not even my party's perspective, on what I think the process of democratization should be like. And I will speak very concretely. The Akbayan, or Citizens Action Party, was formed in 1998, and most of those who formed the party had come from what we might call a socialist perspective, no? Whether it was what one might call from the National Democratic stream or the Social Democratic stream. Nevertheless, they had come from a period whereby they had struggled against the dictatorship, and their strategic visions were, might be called socialist, no? Basically, looking forward to a time when there would be really what you might call democratic control, not only of the political system but also of the economy, no? So I think that's what brought people together. Today, after 14 years, we are part of what you might call the governing coalition in the Aquino Administration. And basically the reason that we joined the governing coalition was because we felt, that we agreed with key aspects of the reform agenda. We fully supported the good governance or anti-corruption thrust of the government, and I think that since corruption is something that exercises Filipinos, whatever class or whatever political stream they come from, we felt that this is to have a government that is determined to root out corruption is certainly a government that needs to be backed. We also have a government that was in many ways very serious about tackling the whole issue of poverty in the country. And this was exemplified in the government's conditional cash transfer program. And the whole idea behind the conditional cash transfer is that if you support a family, that has 3 children to the tune of about 1,450 pesos a month, but on condition that you subject the children to checkups and that they keep the children in school, that this would contribute to breaking the intergenerational cycle of poverty. Now, That, of course, was attacked by a number of groups, including from the right, that said, oh, this is fostering a dependency mentality. However, this was a program that was already tried and tested in a number of countries in Latin America and is now in progress in about 24 countries throughout the world. That it has had successes, especially in Brazil, in bringing large numbers of people from poverty and moving them on a track away from poverty and into occupational and social mobility. And I know that it was controversial in the sense that it's a program that was supported by the World Bank. And for those of us who had been very critical of the World Bank, was this not, in fact, something that was, had many of the limitations of World Bank kind of programs? And we felt, well, it might be supported by the World Bank, but nevertheless, it had originated basically from sources from outside the World Bank. And certainly, the Lula government in Brazil showed that it could work. And the Lula government was a social democratic government. No? So, thirdly, meron ring commitment itong gobyernong ito to the process of social reform. And especially in terms of the completion of the land reform program. Now, of course, when we say commitment, a commitment can be verbal or it may not be true. But oftentimes, you only push to make sure that those who commit themselves are in fact forced to commit themselves. And I realized that when it came to the land reform program, there's been some degree of ambiguity on the part of some of the people within the Aquino government. But nevertheless, having said that, we've continued to press from the left to make sure that the accelerated land reform program, or CARPER, that was passed in 2009, would complete the process of land redistribution. And that's what we've been pressing. So, of course, when you're part of a reform coalition, there are some aspects and people within the reform coalition that they may have different agenda than you, but nevertheless, you decide. If you think that for the most part the reform coalition is going in the right direction, and you can get certain commitments to move in certain ways, then you become part of it. But it is fairly clear that this is not a revolutionary coalition. This is not a coalition or an administration that will establish social democracy or socialism. But certainly, if we assess it's moving in the direction of more democracy and more in both the political and the economic sphere, then we would support that process. And that is, and we feel that in the last few years, the last 3 years, that indeed it was the right choice to make. However, being part of a coalition also means being open to the possibility of eventually either continuing or leaving that coalition. No? So it all depends. If we feel that the administration has stopped or is no longer moving in a certain progressive direction, then we really have to assess where we're at. Okay, so I just wanted to bring it to these concrete items, because when we talk about socialism, we really need to start from the concrete, where we're at. Now, what are some of the more strategic issues here? Well, Akbayan has been for two things. One is for more democratic participation, okay? And secondly, in the political system, and secondly, for a more democratic way of arranging the economy in terms of production and redistribution. Now, if you say more economic democracy, Some people would say that's socialism. Some people would call that social democracy. Some people would call that people's democracy. But nevertheless, what we're really talking about is more popular control of the economy, including more popular control over ownership. Okay? So, first of all, with respect to the more thorough democratization. Now, I think that the question of democracy has always been fairly controversial. Okay, I think most countries in the world have adopted a form called representative democracy, and representative democracy all over the world has exhibited the same kind of advances and pitfalls. Okay. Well, some people would say that the only way that you can run huge, multi-million citizen type of democracies is through representative democracy. That is, basically, you have elections, and you have elections then, choose representatives, and the representatives rule in the name of the people. Okay, so that's the commonly accepted democratic arrangements at this point in time. However, there is also a whole tradition of direct democracy, no? And the whole tradition of direct democracy is that the people, in fact, rule directly, okay? Or they erupt into the political processes directly. Of course, one of the people who inspired the emergence of modern democracy was a Frenchman named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Rousseau was was a very, very sharp thinker and a very, very committed Democrat. And one of the things that's very interesting about Rousseau was he was very skeptical about representative democracy. And basically, and this is why he sort of favored the scale of democracy should just be the size of city-states, no? And the reason Rousseau was very skeptical about representative democracy was he said that the representatives end up representing the corporate will of the representatives rather than the general will of the people. Okay, so the general will. This is supposed to be in massive assemblies, that in which, there's a larger process, there is a bigger entity there that's beyond just the individuals. In the give and take of mass assemblies, the general will emerges, And so this was Rousseau's characterization of the difficulties and pitfalls of representative democracy. And to a great extent, I think there are many elements of truth in Rousseau's characterization. In fact, if you don't watch it, the representatives of the people begin to represent mainly themselves, okay? And there's a greater and greater distance between the people and its representatives. And this kind of thinking and rethinking has become especially, very strong in the United States at this point in time, where basically we have a movement, the Occupy movement on the left, that basically says there's no substitute for direct democracy because, look, the Republicans and the Democrats, they now just represent big capital, okay? And they just represent themselves, okay? So what is the alternative? The alternative is mass, popular, direct democracy. And this is why when you look at the Occupy movement in the States or in Europe, it is a movement that is very, very skeptical, very suspicious of representatives, of electoral representatives. Okay, so this is one of the things that we need to flag. However, are there ways by which we could move from representative democracy in which we can create institutions that more and more approximate direct democracy? My sense is yes. there are possibilities for this in which civil society, in fact, begins to actively participate and not just leave decision-making to representatives. For instance, yung participatory budgeting process dun sa Porto Alegre, in which the people organized in assemblies themselves at the municipal level, at the city level, make an input into the budgetary process. No? And this has now been adopted by hundreds of municipalities throughout the world. And I think it is fair to say that the participatory budgeting process, which now we're trying to organize, to introduce here in the Philippines, imperfectly maybe, this whole idea of bottom-up approach, okay, of budgeting, is perhaps one way by which we can move towards this Porto Alegre participatory budgeting model. The other thing that I think we really need to move towards is we should really think about more organized civil society participation in politics, so that it's not just the people who are elected representatives, but actual members of civil society organizations that make a direct input and institutional input to the political process itself. Okay? And this is not only at the national level, at the local level, but maybe even at the international level. So that's one of the things that we have to figure out. We have to work out the process by which we can make representative democracy more and more yield to direct democratic kinds of arrangements. Second, and I will just end with this, is in the economy. Now, the traditional socialist vision was capitalism would be overcome, and what would happen is that the means of production would go to the state, and the state would, basically eventually wither away, and then you would have communism. Okay, at least that's one of the Marxist visions. However, I think this process, this vision of socialism, became identified with with a sort of centralized bureaucratic state. And the problem with the centralized bureaucratic state as it emerged in Eastern Europe and a number of other countries was, one, it became quite undemocratic because it had a monopoly of control. And secondly, it was fairly inefficient. Okay? Basically that central planning was supposed to be much more efficient than the market. Well, it wasn't. Okay? And what we had was the massive crisis of the Eastern European countries, the massive crisis of the Soviet Union, and then in places like China, the reintroduction of the market. Okay? So that was the big crisis in the 1990s. However, we are now in a situation where we've had another big crisis, and this is the crisis of the market. Okay? Now, the market has failed miserably. Okay? Itong idea that you just leave it to the market has failed in Latin America, it has failed in Africa, it has failed in the United States, in Europe, and now we have a situation whereby globalization and the agents and the ideology of globalization and this idea that the market, just leave it up to the market and the market will make sure that the invisible hand will work to the common good, that has crashed. Okay? And now, in Europe and the United States, basically, it was the way that capital just took off, right? And threw off all state restraints that created this unregulated process, which ended up in the crash of 2008 and which continues till today. Actually, we're now existing in a state of depression in the north. Okay? Now, Europe is really not going to recover for years and years and years. The United States is not going to recover for years and years and years. Asia, kala natin nakatakas na tayo, but China and India are beginning to go down because they were very dependent on markets in the West. Okay, so we're now facing a period of global contraction in which the old solutions offered by capitalism, the old solutions no longer work. And Asia is going to feel this more and more within the next few years. Now, it seems like the Philippine economy is doing well, but the Philippine economy exists in a global economy. And once the global economy tanks, or once the East Asian economy that's dependent on China tanks, we're going to also feel this process. So it is in the context of the crisis of globalization, the crisis of capitalism, that we must really rethink our alternatives. And maybe we shouldn't be too hung up on a name. Maybe we should, what are we really after? We're really after popular control. We're after the redistribution of income. We want to make sure that monopolies, big monopolies, don't control our lives. Do we want the market? Yes, maybe. As a mechanism for distribution, we need the market, but maybe the market that is severely regulated so that it doesn't go haywire. So let me just end by giving you what, not necessarily Akbayan, but my view of what the alternative should look like. Okay? So let me call this the deglobalization perspective. And what is deglobalization all about? It is a paradigm that wants to move beyond the economics of narrow efficiency, in which the key criterion is the reduction of unit cost, and towards an effective economics. What do we mean by an effective economics? One that strengthens social solidarity by subordinating the operations of the market to the values of equity, justice, and community, by enlarging the sphere of democratic decision-making. To use the language of the great Hungarian thinker Karl Polanyi in his book, this is about re-embedding the economy in society instead of having society driven by the market. So basically, there are 11 key prongs of the deglobalization paradigm as it has emerged in our thinking about what, is a good kind of economic regime for developing countries like the Philippines. And I would just like to go very quickly through this and leave it to your judgment if these are doable. One is the production for the domestic market was once again become the center of gravity of the economy rather than production for export markets. So we would be moving away from the paradigm of the last 30 years of export-oriented growth. Secondly, the principle of subsidiarity should be enshrined in economic life by encouraging production at the level of the community and at the national level if this can be done at reasonable cost in order to preserve community. So produce at the lowest possible economic unit as possible so that community is preserved and does not get disrupted. 3, trade policy should be used to protect the local economy from destruction by corporate subsidized commodities with artificially low prices. So trade policy should in fact be subject to the protection, to protect the local economy. 4, industrial policy, which includes subsidies, tariffs, and trade, should be used to revitalize and strengthen the manufacturing sector. 5th, long postponed measures of equitable income distribution and land redistribution can create a vibrant internal market that would serve as the anchor of the economy and produce local financial resources for investment. 6, de-emphasizing growth, emphasizing upgrading the quality of life and maximizing equity in order to reduce environmental disequilibrium. 7, the development and diffusion of environmentally congenial technology in both agriculture and industry. 8, strategic economic decisions cannot be left to the market or to technocrats. Instead, the scope of democratic decision-making in the economy should be expanded so that all vital questions, such as which industries to develop or to phase out, what proportion of the government budget is to be devoted to agriculture, become subject to democratic discussion and choice. In other words, the market and economics must be demystified, their workings made transparent to all, and subject to the democratic decision of all. 9, civil society must constantly monitor and supervise the private sector and the state, a process that should be institutionalized. As the French thinker Pierre Rosanvallon has noted, and I quote, "The growth of the self-generating capacity of civil society stands out as a truly remarkable phenomenon of our era. It represents a real expansion and deepening of the democratic project," unquote. 10, "The property complex should be transformed into a mixed economy that includes community cooperatives, private enterprises, and state enterprises, and excludes transnational corporations." And 11, "Centralized global institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, should be replaced with regional institutions built not on free trade and capital mobility, but on principles of cooperation that, to use the words of Hugo Chavez in describing the Bolivarian alternative for Americas, quote, transcend the logic of capitalism." So let me end by saying that though all of this may sound radical, the espousal of what we might call the perspective of deglobalization is not really new. Deglobalization's pedigree includes the writings of John Maynard Keynes, who at the height of the Depression bluntly stated, one of the great economists of our times, and I quote, "We do not wish to be at the mercy of world forces working out or trying to work out some uniform equilibrium according to the principles of laissez-faire capitalism," unquote. Indeed, he continued, and I quote, "Over an increasingly wide range of industrial products and perhaps agricultural products also, I become doubtful whether the economic cost of self-sufficiency is great enough to outweigh the other advantages of gradually bringing the producer and the consumer within the ambit of the same national, economic, and financial organization. Experience accumulates to prove that most modern mass production processes can be performed in most countries and climates with almost equal efficiency," unquote. This challenges the heart of neoliberal capitalism. And with words that have a very contemporary ring, Keynes concluded, and I quote, "I sympathize with those who would minimize rather than with those who would maximize economic entanglement between nations. Ideas, knowledge, art, hospitality, travel, these are the things which would of their nature be international. But let goods be homespun whenever it is reasonably and conveniently possible, and above all, let finance be primarily national." So I would just like to end there by saying that this is a period in which global capitalism has failed. This is a period whereby we should really exert our efforts to rethink what paradigms we want, and let us not be sort of seduced by the seeming stability of the economic system right now in the Philippines, 6.1% growth, because what has happened with globalization is that we became part and parcel of a globalized economy. That globalized economy is in trouble, and we better be prepared for the time when that trouble reaches this country. Thank you very much.